In our Life of David sermon series, you can turn to page 227 in your Bibles, 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is a chapter about fear. 1 Samuel chapter 17, page 227. After 7 sermons in this Life of David series, we finally met David a couple weeks ago. Prophet Samuel had anointed that first king of Israel named Saul, and Saul had some victories, but he also disobeyed God. And so we read that God instructed Samuel to anoint a new king. He was going to take over for Saul, and it turned out that it was this shepherd boy. Maybe boy is not the right word there. Maybe teenager, upper teenager, maybe a young man in his early 20s. We don't know exactly how old David was, but he wasn't old. But he was a shepherd. And he had these older brothers, but they did not get picked. Samuel anointed David. We read that the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power when he was anointed. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16, it concludes with David actually traveling to King Saul's house from time to time because he was going to play the harp for King Saul. Saul was regularly afflicted with seemed to be a combination of spiritual and psychological oppression, and David's music would calm him. So that brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is a famous one. This is a story of David versus Goliath. Now, how do we normally understand David versus Goliath? It's perhaps the classic underdog story, right? In sports, war, in a political election, in just about any arena where there is a weaker, smaller person or group that is pitted against an opposition that is bigger and stronger and more powerful. Maybe there's more money on one side. Maybe there's more experience on one side. We tend to call that a David versus Goliath situation, right? How many of you remember the Super Bowl in 2018 when the Eagles were up against the mighty Tom Brady Patriots? That was supposed to be a David versus Goliath situation. Now what we're going to find out is that the original David and Goliath story is actually not an underdog story. Let's take a look at the first 3 verses in chapter 17 to kind of get the context of the story. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. So we have these 2 armies, the Philistines on one side, the Israelites on the other side. They're facing each other. They can see each other on opposing hillsides. Now we've heard this name, the Philistines, in this Life of David series quite frequently. These are 2 nations that have been at war over and over and over again. It's been going on for years. But this battle is unique. Let's keep reading to find out why. Look at verse 4. We read there, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels, and on his legs he wore bronze greaves and a bronze javelin slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. He was tall, he was well-equipped, he was a monster. We read that the Philistines have a secret weapon named Goliath. He also has a shield bearer that's going with him to kind of help him out with all of this. I mean, this would have been intimidating, fearsome. Furthermore, as we keep reading, we learn that the Philistines are using Goliath in a unique method of ancient warfare, and we read about that starting in verse 8. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man. Let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So each side is to send out a single warrior to represent their army. Whichever soldier wins this one-on-one fight, they will have won the battle for the whole army. Kind of is a good idea, in the sense that you're not losing thousands and thousands of lives. But King Saul of Israel and the armies of Israel are terrified. Who wouldn't be, right? Goliath is a freak of nature. Who could fight this guy? Here's what's sometimes missed in the story, though. Israel had a giant too. It's true. Israel had a tall man. He wasn't as tall as Goliath, but he was a man who was head and shoulders taller than the rest. You know who it was? King Saul. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 2, we read that Saul was impressive. He was without equal among all Israel. He was a head taller than the others. He should have been the one to go out and fight Goliath, but he didn't. In fact, no one from Israel's army wanted to face that guy. They were terrified. And it's a reminder to us that fear is crippling, just as Debbie said. Fear can cause you to forget the truth. Fear can cause you to get fixated on disaster. Have you ever succumbed to fear? Have you ever assumed that a situation is just the worst possible situation it could be? I've been there before. If I'm driving down the road and I start to hear a new noise in my vehicle, maybe you've been there. You can think to yourself, "Oh man, this thing's falling apart. We're going to have to get a whole new vehicle." You ever done that? Assuming the worst. Allowing fear to grip you. If we let it, fear can cripple us. Maybe it's not about a car. Maybe it's about a relationship. Maybe it's about your children or grandchildren. Maybe it's about your finances and your job. Saul and all Israel allowed Goliath to fill their hearts with fear. Now jump down to verse 16 and look at that. We read that this was going on for 40 days. 40 days. Goliath would come out twice a day. He would challenge any Israelite soldier to fight him. And it never happened. I get that. As Michelle can tell you, I can very often face a situation in my life where rather than dealing with the fear, I allow it to cripple me and just say, "Oh, let's just let it go. Maybe the situation will change for the better. Maybe that Goliath will just go away." But what happens during those 40 days? If you've been there before, probably you can't sleep good. Might affect how you eat. Can ruin your lives. You can become a terrible person to be around. Sometimes our friends and family will try and help us out, but fear can get a stranglehold on our lives and lock us down. We know it's no way to live. We're not enjoying it, but we're stuck. That seems to have been happening to Saul and the army of Israel. Fear locked them down into inaction. Back in verse 12, we learn that David entered the story. The scene shifts from the battlefront back to his hometown of Bethlehem. We learn that David's father Jesse is now well advanced in years, and David's 3 oldest brothers were serving in the army. I'm just going to summarize verses 17 through 24. And here's what happens. Jesse, his father, gives David some food to take to his brothers who were in the army with Saul. He does it. He travels from Bethlehem to the battlefront, and he gives the food to the keeper of supplies. But then David makes a choice. Instead of going back home, he wants to go see the battle lines. He comes and he greets his brothers just as Goliath steps out to challenge the army of Israel. In verse 24, the author writes that when this happened, the army of Israel ran in great fear. And there's David watching. Now, like I said, David is just a young man at this point. Upper teens, maybe lower 20s. And can you imagine him watching as this scene plays out, seeing it for the first time? This giant and the army of Israel running in fear. I don't know if this was all brand new for David. Maybe he'd observed the army before, but maybe it was his first time. Look at verses 25 through 27. It seems that though Goliath has been defying the army of Israel for 40 days, it might have been the first time David was learning about this. Look at how he describes it in verse 26. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Right from David's mouth, a beacon of trust in God in the middle of what had been nothing but fear for 40 days. I mean, David's incredulous that anyone, even a massive giant like Goliath, has been allowed to defy God for 40 days. We kind of see from David this sliver of righteous anger that maybe there's a new viewpoint on this situation of fear. But before we get too excited about David, we need to remember that his three oldest brothers are there also. Imagine how they felt when their little brother starts belting out this righteous anger. Now, David's questions, whether or not he meant it this way, are essentially confronting his brothers too. He's essentially calling out his brothers as well. Why aren't they stepping out and fighting Goliath? If you have siblings, you know how that can go over. Especially from the younger one, right? Do you think his oldest brother, whose name was Eliab, is going to look at his little brother and say to his little brother, "Thank you, David, for confronting me. I really needed those hard questions in my life today. Thank you for pointing out my failings and my weaknesses. I needed that, and I'm about to now go out and fight Goliath." Not a chance. Look at verse 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." He's really upset. And it's entirely possible that he's not just making stuff up here. It's entirely possible that he's not just embarrassed that his little brother is calling him out. It could be that Eliab and the brothers had watched David grow up, and they knew this was like him. Like he had this tendency to be like that. Maybe David was nosy. Maybe he was annoying to his older brothers. We all know how that sibling dynamic can go. Now, we don't know for certain that that's the situation going on in this particular story. It could just be that Eliab is angry that David confronted him, and he's kind of playing it off now, accusing David of being irresponsible. Leaving his sheep behind, coming to be entertained, not really taking care of things. David could have come to Bethlehem, or come to the battle lines, left the food for the brothers with the keeper of the food, and immediately gone back and taken care of the sheep. But he didn't. Look at verse 22 again. He ran to those battle lines. And his brothers probably knew that there was something going on there. because they had probably seen David do this kind of thing back in Bethlehem before. In other words, what we're reading is sibling drama. It happens all the time with brothers and sisters. Blaming each other, fighting. How's David going to respond, though? Look at verse 29. At first, it seems like David responds exactly like you would expect the younger one to respond in a fight like this. The first line is loaded with this history of sibling drama when he says, "Now what have I done?" You only say that if you've been confronted many times before. We're reading here what was almost certainly a repeat issue between David and his brothers. And then David says, "Can I even speak?" We've heard people talk like that in families, right? It's kind of a loaded statement. My guess is that David had opened his mouth in front of his brothers many times, and they didn't appreciate it because he's the little kid. They're the men. Shut your mouth, little kid. We're on the brink of a full-blown fight between brothers here. Which is kind of crazy when you consider that the real context of the story is it's two armies that are fighting against each other. But just as quickly as this brotherly fight is about to erupt, it's done. Because David makes a choice. It's really interesting. Look at verse 30. He turns away. Chooses not to engage his brother. It seems like he knows that nothing productive is going to come from a spat with his older brother Eliab, probably because nothing productive has come of those spats many times before. It's a wise move. He shuts it down. He moves on. Most sibling fights are totally unproductive and unnecessary. I wish a bunch of the younger siblings were here so that I could have them hear this morning. David chooses to disengage, to turn away, but he is far from done. He kind of could, if he wanted to, just receive his words from his older brother as kind of like a verbal spanking and just go back home. Instead, there's something much more important at hand that he focuses on. The defiant enemy giant, Goliath. That's the real enemy. And David remains incredulous that no one is stepping up to face this guy. So in verse 30, we learn that David begins bringing up this matter to other people. He's persistent about it, and eventually in verse 31, those other people report David to the king. For the first time in 40 days, Saul gets a report that maybe someone is willing to go out and face this giant. So Saul calls for this person to be brought to him. Maybe a big part of the reason that Saul is so excited about this is because now Saul's off the hook. He should have been the one to do it. And look what David says to Saul in verse 32. It's so bold. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." It's bold, but it's ridiculous. A young shepherd poet versus this battle-hardened, armored giant? Really, this is not good. If I'm Saul, I'm thinking, this guy? This isn't who I want to go fight this. I want a soldier. Look at verse 33. Basically, Saul says that. "Come on, David, you're just a boy." Notice Saul's first line. It really shows where his heart is at. It shows a bit about his thinking. It shows why he's gripped with fear. Saul leads with this line. He says, "You are not able to go out and fight against this Philistine." It shows how small, how limited is Saul's vision. It shows how weak is his trust in God in the middle of what appears to be an impossible situation. Saul has limited himself to a human way of thinking about this difficult situation. And what's more, God is nowhere to be found in Saul's vision of what is possible. But look how different David's response is. Look at verse 34. David says to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." David is laser focused on what God can do. God will rescue him. And so in the midst of crippling fear from what looks to be insurmountable odds, David has trust in God. He's able to view the situation, therefore, truthfully. Saul and the rest of the armies had a false view because they were not trusting in God. And we see that human response of Saul in verses 38 and 39. He says, "Well then, okay, David, you better put on a whole bunch of armor and take some weaponry with you." He continues to view the situation in his limited way. The Israelite army seems to be putting faith in human means. They see no way to overcome Goliath, and yet they're the people of God. They have this long history of God's amazing, miraculous work and empowerment in their lives. They could go back and hear all the stories about how God intervened. They might even be able to remember it from their recent past. As you think about a judge like Samson, who was empowered by God. Even though Samson was a flawed character, he was empowered by God to do some amazing victory over the Philistines. And that was only decades before this. But it seems like Saul and the Israelites don't remember that. They look at their own size. They look at their own armor or lack of it. They look at their own weapons or lack of it, and they conclude they are no match for Goliath. They're stuck in their fear. And so when this one man steps forward with no armor, Saul is locked into his human viewpoint. There's no way David can fight this guy. So maybe David needs to put on a little bit more armor and have a little better weaponry. David tries. But immediately, as he's wearing this heavy armor and carrying these heavy weapons, he thinks this isn't going to work. Takes off the armor, and he goes out to face Goliath without any of it. Now, my guess is that, for the most part, you've been tracking with this story. I mean, how many of you have heard the David and Goliath story before? Just about everybody, right? This is a long, famous one. So far, it's probably sounded very much like what you've heard. It's a classic underdog story. As David walks out to the Israelite battle lines, heading in Goliath's direction, again, I would like to suggest to you, this is not an underdog story. Maybe you're thinking, well, of course, David has God on his side. Therefore, he's never been an underdog. And that's true, I definitely agree with it, but that's not what I'm getting at. We'll certainly see God's involvement in the story, but there is something else going on here, something important. Scholars who have researched ancient warfare tell us that as we read in verse 40, when David pulls out his slingshot, when he reaches down and picks up the stone to use as a missile in his slingshot, that every soldier on both armies' battle lines would know that if David was any good with the sling, this battle was over before it began. Why? David has a distinct advantage as a slinger. How many of you have seen the film Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark? Classic. You remember the scene when Indiana is chasing this guy through this super busy, crowded market? And then all of a sudden, from out of the crowd jumps a guy who gets between Indy and the guy he's chasing. And the guy that gets between him has a sword, and he's doing all these incredible motions with his sword. He's obviously a really good swordsman. The bad guy's getting away. Indy has no sword to fight back. He's got his whip, right? It's not going to do much against the sword. And it seems as though Indy has lost the bad guy. He might also be in danger of losing his life as well because of that sword. What does Indy do? Does anybody remember? That's right. He's got a pistol, his secret weapon. Shoots the guy, just like that. Game over. Indiana wins and he keeps chasing the bad guy. What's the lesson of that story? Guns beat swords. Period. It's the same thing with David's sling. He's got a far superior weapon and he's good with it. We've already learned that he beat the lion and the bear. Ancient slingers would put these golf ball sized stones in their slings and they would whip them super fast. And they could launch them with deadly accuracy. Slingers in ancient warfare were the artillery. And if an army could keep far enough away from the opposing infantry, the slingers could just launch volley after volley after volley of these golf ball-sized missiles, and it would devastate the enemy. They were worse or more devastating than archers, believe it or not. And so as David pulls out his sling and stone, all the soldiers on both sides could see what was coming. Except Goliath, which is weird, right? Goliath was a battle-hardened soldier. He should know the power of a sling. He should be running away at this point, actually. Like literally, Goliath should know, oh, this is not good. Except we read in verse 41, Goliath continues to go closer and closer to David. He's making it easier for David to hit him. Why? Why would Goliath make such an obvious mistake? Maybe he felt he could quickly rush David and overtake him before David could get that sling and stone out. Maybe. But a good slinger could move fast. Maybe Goliath is just arrogant with his size and his armor and his skills. Scholars believe there's a totally different reason for why Goliath kept moving closer to David. They believe Goliath could not see David well. He had to get closer to bring David into focus. You might think, how in the world do they get that from this passage, that Goliath can't see well? Well, let me explain. Modern science has studied people in our day and age who grow abnormally large. In fact, when I was a kid, my parents took us to Niagara Falls and we went to Ripley's Believe It or Not. That was there. If you've ever been to one of those, they're kind of amazing. At this particular Ripley's Believe It or Not, they had a giant. It was a woman. And it was like a show where you went and sat in seats, and at some point they brought her out. It was unbelievable, especially for me as a kid. She was gigantic, taller than anyone, and really huge. It was kind of sad though, because it was as if she was on a just like circus sideshow, that she would just walk out for people to see how big she was. And I remember her with this just forlorn look on her face as she smoked a cigarette, and there was an interviewer there, and it was like she did not want to be there. It was a really, really sad situation. It was eerie. She had a genetic condition, and it's called acromegaly, in which humans don't stop growing. Maybe you've heard reports about this. It's a scientific, a medical condition. One of the particular symptoms that is incredibly common in people who have acromegaly is poor eyesight. So we know about Goliath's huge size. It is possible he had acromegaly and he simply could not see David well. Look at verse 43. Clearly he's arrogant. He is convinced he will win. He sees that David is small, but notice that he says that David comes at him with sticks, plural. Not one stick, but sticks. David had a staff, as we read in verse 40, but only one staff. So it's very possible that the scholars are right, that Goliath had poor eyesight. It might have even been a kind of double vision, making him thinking he's seeing more than one. He thinks David is going to try and defeat him with sticks. And he's right. If that's all that was going on, that would be a ridiculous battle. If that's all David had, Goliath would easily eliminate him. But here's the thing. It doesn't seem that Goliath sees David's sling. And therefore, though Goliath is this giant, armed to the teeth, he's now in an extremely vulnerable position. He has made it that much easier for David to kill him. This is not an underdog story. But maybe you're thinking, but doesn't that remove God's involvement from the story? I always thought this was kind of a miracle story. I don't think that this has any detriment to God's involvement in the story at all. David still shows amazing trust in God. Look what he says in verses 45 through 47. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. And I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. David's confidence is rooted solidly in God's presence and provision. In the middle of what appears to be this insurmountable situation, in the middle of what appears to be impossible, David clearly sees the God of the possible. He believes it, and he acts accordingly. Here's the thing. David wouldn't know about acromegaly. That's only a recent thing. But he would know that trusting in God, along with the slingshot, was the best option. Now, it's important to remember, nobody else is stepping forward at this point. Everybody watching is probably wide-eyed, wondering what is going to happen here. Saul's not stepping forward. He should have had the trust in God to step forward, but he didn't. He had denied God, and God's Spirit left him. It's kind of what led to the situation, to David becoming a king, or anointed as king, and filled with the Spirit. And the rest is history. David is filled with the Spirit, and he uses the sling, and in one shot drills Goliath in the head. That fast-moving stone penetrating Goliath's forehead, either killing him instantly or knocking him unconscious, so that David can go forward and cut off his head. At that, the Philistine army freaks out and retreats, and the army of Israel pursues them, slaughtering many. It's a massive victory. So the story of David and Goliath is not an underdog story. It's really a story of blindness. Not only was Goliath likely suffering from poor eyesight, but he was blinded by his pride and arrogance. He probably had never lost a hand-to-hand battle in close quarters where he could see his enemy. And he assumed he would do the same thing here. But it's not just Goliath who had bad eyesight. Israel and King Saul were blinded by their fear. They couldn't see anything other than devastation and loss. There's only really one person in this story who can see. David, because he's trusting in God. He is able to see the truth of the situation. So how can we have David's approach of trust in the middle of our own seemingly impossible situations? How do we approach life with trust rather than fear? It's amazing to me that David at such a young age is able to have that attitude of trust that leads to the actions of faithfulness. Sometimes we wonder, was he just naive? Did he have that childlike faith that didn't really have the experience of the world? I don't know. He had to deal with some hard stuff, he says, the lion, the bear. It seems real. It can be that real for us as well. We can have God's vision in those seemingly impossible situations in our lives. We can see truth in the middle of our fear. So how do we develop this trust? What do you actually do to take that step of faith in God? Well, like David, who clearly and repeatedly brings God into the conversation there that day, we must start with a decision to trust in God. And then we spend time in prayer. I think especially in thanksgiving. Remembering that it is God who is powerful and who has poured out his blessings and his faithfulness on our lives. Another excellent way is to meditate on Scripture, especially the phrase that so often pops up in Scripture, do not be afraid. Remember how David was a poet? We've already heard some of his writing this morning. He spent much time with God. We're blessed to have so many of his poems in the Psalms today. Turn with me to Psalm 73. Many of David's Psalms are almost like his personal journal where he's reflecting on events in his life. Now, none of his Psalms actually mention the battle with Goliath, but this one, I said Psalm 73. I'm sorry. There are 73 Psalms that are attributed to David. We're going to be looking at Psalm 27. Page 443. Psalm 27, 443. This one could really seem like David has this battle with Goliath in mind. Psalm 27, he writes this: "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked advance against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. For in the day of trouble he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his sacred tent and set me high upon a rock. Then my head will be exalted above the enemies who surround me. At his sacred tent I will sacrifice with shouts of joy. I will sing and make music to the Lord. Hear my voice when I call, Lord. Be merciful to me and answer me. My heart says of you, seek his face. Your face, Lord, I will seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You have been my helper. Do not reject me or forsake me, God my Savior. Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. Teach me your way, Lord. Lead me in a straight path because of my oppressors. Do not turn me over to the desire of my foes, for false witnesses rise up against me, spouting malicious accusations. I remain confident of this: I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. And so we conclude with those words. We see in David's bold confrontation of Goliath one who has reflected on the beauty and the faithfulness of God. We see in David one who has remembered who God is in the midst of his struggle. And we see one who then has the confidence to respond in the middle of fear. He reflects on God. God is bigger, God is stronger, God is faithful, God is the victor. In Psalm 27 verse 4 he says that the one thing he seeks is to gaze on the beauty of the Lord. Now, David spent a lot of time as a shepherd with sheep, but clearly he also spent time reflecting on who God is. Look at verse 8. He says, "Seek his face." David is a wonderful example of how important it is to be a person who seeks the Lord, to spend time thinking about seeking after God. Can that be said of us? Can that be said of you? That we open up that time to seek the face of the Lord so that we know him and dwell on him. So that when those fearful situations come, we can choose the path of faithfulness. What will it look like for you and I to open up more time to seek the face of God? David then remembers what God has done, remembers that God has given him victory over the lion and the bear. And so also remember how God has been faithful to you. There's something incredibly powerful about remembering God's provision in the past. So there's that work of reflection and remembering that opens our eyes to the truth when we've been blinded by fear. And so when we have that strength that God gives us from reflecting on him and remembering what he's done, we can step forward to respond and face those fears. We need not be blinded by inaction. Reflecting on the truth about God and remembering his faithfulness removes the blinders of fear and helps us courageously step forward in obedience to him. So like Debbie asked you, what fear do you have in life? Is your response more like Saul or David? Take time to reflect on who God is. Take time to remember what he's done in your life. And then step forward, responding to face that fear, knowing that God is with you.